Thanks, Julie. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Very good. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for this PFAS rule implementation webinar. Um, Next slide, please. Couple of housekeeping notes that Julie mentioned. We'd appreciate it if you kept your microphones muted and cameras off to assist with us moving through this presentation efficiently. As Julie mentioned, this session is being recorded. You'll receive a link to this recording and handouts within about a week. Some of the material, such as laboratory result examples, it's a little bit small to read on the screen. So you should be able to utilize the plus minus buttons at the top of your screen if the material is too small to see, to zoom in and zoom out to help you with that. During the presentation, all questions will be handled through the meeting chat. We do have staff moderating the chat in the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer those questions as they appear. We'll also be wrapping them up at the end of the presentation for anything we haven't gotten to, but please use the chat function, which appears as a little thought bubble on the bottom right of your screen. Julie mentioned the contact hours that are being offered to this webinar, and you'll see something coming into the chat towards the end of the webinar for that. We intend to have more webinars as PFAS deadlines approach. We will include this information in future webinar advertisements as well as far as contact hours are concerned. Next slide, please. I want to cover the agenda we have for the webinar today. We're going to start with a quick overview of our agenda and introductions. The primary focus of this webinar is to ensure that Waterworks understand the requirements of the PFAS rule that require action in the near future, and that Waterworks should be concerning themselves with now, and provide some information that will help them meet these requirements. Since we know many of us on this call are well versed in this subject, I'm going to start with just a brief overview of what PFAS is and the issues that PFAS cause. Then Diana Magner will be providing an overview of the rule requirements, and I'll discuss the legal challenges and proposed rule changes that have arisen from those challenges. We'll cover how to interpret results received from the laboratory, and then Bob Edelman will be covering UCMR 5 data and some recent progress we've made in submitting results to ODW. Robert Kiefer will then give us a presentation on sample collection best practices, and we'll finish up with Lisa Crabtree discussing the use of previously collected data in meeting initial monitoring requirements. Then we'll wrap up the webinar with time. Next slide, please. All right, brief introduction into PFAS and what they are. Next slide. Of course, PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They are a group of man-made chemicals, primarily started manufacturing in the 1940s. They are used in household and industrial resources for their water, grease, and stain-resistant properties, as well as heat resistance. They are made up of long-chain molecules where carbon and fluorine atoms are bound together. Those bonds are very short and strong and hard to break. So that these chemicals don't break down in nature readily or easily. That's why they're known as forever chemicals. Many uses for these products are for firefighting foams, food packaging, such as your burger wraps. Of course, many of these are being removed or reformulated. Legacy PFAS chemicals such as PFOA and PFOS have been outlawed, but shorter chain PFAS chemicals are still in manufacture and use today. They accumulate in the environment. Next slide, please, and show you how that kind of works in reality. So a closer look is the usage of these chemicals gets deposited into water, soil, and even air through many different mechanisms. They bioaccumulate since they don't degrade at all in the soil and groundwater, even in the food products that we consume, both agriculturally and animal tissues. So people are bioaccumulating PFAS in their body regularly through many different avenues. It is a prevalent problem that has been decided to be addressed from the drinking water perspective through EPA regulation. But there are many different ways that we can introduce PFAS into our bodies. Next slide, please. Health effects of PFAS. There have been many different studies showing different health effects, and these continue today as we're learning more and more about toxicity and epidemiological results and outcomes for PFAS bioaccumulation in human blood and tissues. There's increased risk of thyroid disease, blood cholesterol levels, lower infant birth weights, and instances of birth defects have increased with increasing levels of PFAS in people's blood. So it is a prevalent problem within the environment. The EPA has decided to take a stance on that as far as drinking water is concerned. So that's what we're here to discuss today. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Diana Magner, who's going to discuss the beginning of regulations overviews, and then I'll pick it up with EPA updates.
Hi, I'm Diana. I am the sample verification specialist for the Richmond field office. Next slide. In April 26, 2024, the EPA published the Per and Polyfluoral Alkyl Substances National Primary Drinking Water Regulation. I'm going to call that the PFAS rule. The PFAS rule requires all community and non-transient, non-community water systems to monitor for PFAS. The rule has two key deadlines within it. By April 26, 2027, all required waterworks have to complete their initial monitoring requirements. And when the rule was published, all required waterworks had to be in compliance with the maximum contaminant levels in that rule by April 26, 2029. They have since extended the deadline to be in compliance with the MCLs to 2031. We will talk more about changes to the rule since it was published on a future slide. Next slide, please. These are the MCLs that were published within the rule. The maximum contaminant level compliance is determined by calculating a running annual average at each entry point for each chemical. The MCLs for PFOA and PFAS are 4.0 parts per trillion. PFHXS, HPFODA, and PFNA all have an MCL of 10. You'll also see that there is something called a trigger level for each of these chemicals. The trigger level is 1/2 of the MCL, and the trigger level will be used to determine the monitoring frequency once initial monitoring has ended. The PFAS rule also has something called a hazard index within it. If your sample result indicates the presence of 2 or more PFAS chemicals, we will calculate the hazard index. The MCL for the hazard index is 1.0 and the trigger level is 0.5. Next slide, please. The number of samples that your waterworks will need to take during initial monitoring will be dependent on the source water for your system, the size of your waterworks, and how many entry points you have. Surface water sources for any population size will be required to take 4 quarterly samples, with the samples taken 2 to 4 months apart. Groundwater sources serving over 10,000 persons a day will also take 4 quarterly samples, spaced out 2 to 4 months apart. Groundwater sources serving 10,000 persons or less a day will take 2 samples collected 5 to 7 months apart. Each entry point has its own initial monitoring requirements, and it is possible for systems with multiple entry points to have different schedules for each entry point based on your water source and population size. If you have a Goody well, Goody wells are considered surface water, so that would be 4 quarterly samples, 2 to 4 months apart. If your entry point blends surface water and groundwater together, you would be on a quarterly schedule as well. If your entry point alternates between surface water for one part of the year and groundwater for a different part of the year, you would still be required to take 4 quarterly samples. Next slide. There are 3 approved methods that you can use to take your samples. Methods 533, 537.1 version 1, and 537.1 version 2 are all approved for initial monitoring. Please note that if you use method 537.1 version 1, that is only approved for initial monitoring. So once initial monitoring ends on April 26, 2027, you would need to use one of the other 2 approved methods for any samples taken after that date. When you get your sample kit from the lab, they will include a field reagent blank or FRB sample kit that must be collected at each entry sample point. So the lab will send you a bottle of certified PFAS-free water, and that will be part of your sampling requirements. You'll pour that PFAS-free water into a different container at the same time and location that you take your PFAS samples from the entry point, and you'll ship that back to the lab with your entry point samples. We recommend that you talk to your laboratory about only testing the FRB samples if your entry point sample indicated the presence of PFAS. Next slide. Once initial monitoring ends, all water systems will begin monitoring for PFAS either on a quarterly or a triennial monitoring frequency. If all of your initial sample results were below the trigger levels, you will automatically be eligible to move into triennial monitoring, 1 sample per entry point per 3 years. If any of your initial sample results meet or exceed a trigger level, you will start on quarterly monitoring, 1 sample per entry point per quarter. However, if your system collects 4 consecutive quarterly samples that are all below the MCL, that system would be eligible to move to reduced annual monitoring, 1 sample per entry point per year. Next slide. And I'm going to pass this back to Bailey to do this slide.
Thank you, Don. I appreciate it. So this is just a flow chart that was published by the EPA to assist in understanding what the initial monitoring sample results will mean for compliance monitoring sampling, as just covered. We have this flow chart as well as another flow chart that's more text-based to follow on our website if you want to go to our website to view this as well. But essentially, once you have your initial monitoring results and you started with that in the top left corner, you follow this flow chart system to determine what your requirements are from that point on. If any of your samples collected in the initial monitoring phase exceed a trigger level of PFAS, then you will default to quarterly monitoring samples until you can essentially test out of that. So if you follow down on the left-hand side of the flow chart, it gets down to default quarterly monitoring samples. You are in rule violation if you exceed a running annual average greater than the MCL at that point, which will trigger notification and violations notices at that point when the compliance date occurs. If you have 4 consecutive samples in the quarterly monitoring period less than the MCLs, then you will then start annual monitoring. So you're moving away from the left to the right in this flow chart. If you continue to get clean samples less than the MCL, 3 consecutive annual monitoring samples less than the MCL, you will then default to triennial monitoring once every 3 years. Again, any sample results on running annual average basis that exceed the MCL will be considered a rule violation in annual monitoring. You'll move back to the default quarterly monitoring period. But if you have clean samples from that point on, 3 consecutive, you will then go into triennial monitoring. And that stays in triennial monitoring until you have an exceedance of the MCL levels on a running annual average basis. Otherwise, you'll just maintain a triennial monitoring period frequency. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd discuss, we went through the rule and the requirements related to that. I thought I would discuss a little bit about some of the updates that have been happening regarding some legal challenges. So once the rule was published in its final form, a couple of organizations, the American Waterworks Association, as well as the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, filed a legal suit. And that was in October of 2024, challenging the determination of MCL levels, whether they were health-based and appropriately decided or not, as well as the concept of the hazard index as an MCL mechanism. What followed past that, you'll see on the slide, is a series of recourse and abeyances from EPA. They had asked for some stays in the rule. In February, when the new administration took over EPA, they requested a 60-day abeyance to review the rule and determine what course of action they wanted to take relative to this legal challenge. They had a couple more of abeyances from that point on in April and in May, and immediately after that May abeyance, they announced a potential change that's intended for the rule. And they are still in an abeyance period, but the legal challenge is still in the courts, and they are going to have further updates in September. Next slide, please. So what did EPA announce in May? They announced proposed changes to the rule. They announced that they intend to rescind the regulations on PFHXS, PFNA, and the Gen X chemicals, and rescind the hazard index, which includes PFBS as well. So essentially, they've determined that they're only going to maintain MCLs for PFOA and PFOS chemicals. They also intend to extend the compliance deadline from 2029 to 2031. They are going to establish a federal exemption framework. They are going to launch an outreach initiative called PFS Out to support water systems in small and rural communities. They are going to increase polluter accountability measures. And they're also talking about enhancement for the water technical assistance program. So additional technical assistance to Waterworks, especially the small and rural communities. Now, with their intention to rescind the MCLs for the 4 chemicals that are included in the hazard index, well, what we found in the data that has been collected thus far is almost entirely, if there is an exceedance of MCL levels for one of those chemicals, there is also an exceedance of PFOS and PFOA. I think there's 1 or 2 water systems in Virginia that either exceeded a MCL for one of the hazard index chemicals without exceeding PFOA and PFOS. So maintaining the levels of PFOA and PFOS at 4 parts per trillion essentially does not change the requirements of the rule as far as compliance deadlines are concerned for Virginia Waterworks. Next slide, please. So we'll want to get into a little bit of result interpretation and data submission. Next slide, please. So how should we be determining results? We've discussed the amount of samples that need to be taken, and Waterworks will be receiving laboratory reports that are pretty detailed and involved. So we wanted to walk through a couple of these laboratory reports and highlight some areas that should be reviewed. As you see on the screen, this is an example of one laboratory report. And if you dig down into the results, you'll see that the results are given for many chemicals, depending on which method you use. Up to 31, 33 chemicals should be listed here with many different results. You'll notice that each result has an MDL and an MRL, the MRL being the reporting limit the laboratory will report to. You want to look to ensure that your laboratory is reporting down to an MRL or a PQL of 2.0, which is the trigger level for PFOA and PFOS. Any data that is below that reporting limit but above the MDL will be reported most likely as a number and will come with a qualifier code of J. And you'll see one in the middle of the screen here. There is a qualifier code where that analyte itself was given an analytical number, but is below the reporting limit of the laboratory itself. Next slide, please. This is another example of an analytical result that might be received. You'll notice that the laboratory has highlighted some of these results that have exceeded either their MRL levels, so the reporting levels, or their MDL levels, whether they're J flagged, and you'll see that J qualifier again in there. Many laboratories will provide narrative results that are an explanation of what is seen, because there is a lot of chemicals to review here. And you'll also be seeing quality control results as well. Next slide, please. So when reviewing sample results, you really want to focus on, for now, the still remaining 6 regulated compounds. Click the next slide. And you'll see you can just pick them out of the list that is available from the laboratory report itself. So you'll be evaluating those for compliance purposes. Now, it is the EPA's intention just to reduce down to PFOA and PFOS, and they're intending to do that through regulation this fall for a proposed rule, with the intention for a final rule next spring. But until that rule has been published, we still need to be prepared for evaluation of all 6 chemicals. And so that's why we're presenting this material this way today. Next slide. So laboratory reports may include QA and QC data for spike results, blank results, and laboratory control sample results. You'll see this one below is a matrix spike result. You'll notice some of the analytes have qualifier codes on them that might potentially mean that they did not meet their quality control material. You would only evaluate the regulated analytes as far as meeting quality control objectives for a matrix spike. Matrix spikes are also dependent, only indicative of issues for that sample alone and not for an entire batch of samples. So matrix spike data should be evaluated only for the sample that was spiked itself. Next slide, please. So here you have blank data, and the important thing to notice here is that the blanks, whether it's a laboratory reagent blank or field reagent blank, are 2 different things. A laboratory blank, any blank exceedances impact the entire batch and your data would be qualified. The laboratory should not be sending us qualified data for compliance purposes or initial monitoring purposes, and that'll be addressed in a little bit later in the slides. But one of those things the laboratory should be evaluating and not resulting out is if they have quality control failures that impact their entire run. Next slide. Here you might see what's called a laboratory control sample, an LCS, where you should expect to see results, and you should be expecting to see them with a percentage recovery that you see on the right that's within the limits of percentage recovery criteria for those analytes. Again, an LCS that's outside of the percentage recovery limits for an analyte that is a regulated analyte would disqualify that result for the entire batch. Next slide, please. So this is another dive into some blank contamination. This is an example of a real-world report that we received during our phase 2 analysis, in which case we found that sample results that we received, that's on the left-hand side, the entry point sample results we received, came back with about field reagent blanks that were typically or about the same for all the analytes, which indicated that there was a potential for contamination in the field when the sample was collected. These are very low levels to measure at, and contamination is a real concern. So we'll be covering some sample collection best practices in future part of this presentation. But just as for awareness, evaluating your FRB results against your sample results would indicate whether you had a contamination event in the field or not. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to move it over to Bob Edelman, who's our Division of Technical Services Director for UCMR 5 data review.
Thank you, Bailey. Many of our Virginia water systems were involved in the UCMR 5 sampling program that's required by EPA. The thing about that program is that started before the PFAS rule was finalized, and so some things don't quite line up. The problem is that the minimum reporting level for the UCMR 5 is set at or above the trigger level for 4 of the 5 compounds. So if you look at the table in the middle of the slide here, the minimum reporting level, for example, for PFOA is 4 parts per trillion, whereas the trigger level is 2.0. And so the problem with that is that data is not satisfactory and doesn't meet the requirements of the PFAS rule. And so there is a solution to that, and that is that the laboratory needs to reprocess the data to a new method reporting limit. And so the issue is that medium and large waterworks who hired the laboratory need to reach out to their UCMR 5 laboratory and request them to reprocess the data to the required reporting limits. For water systems that were small, EPA hired those laboratories, and EPA is requesting those laboratories to reprocess the data for small waterworks. Let's go on to the next slide. And so for the small systems, EPA will communicate with the water systems and the states about how to access the reprocessed data. So in other words, there's going to be a new set of results and data created from that reprocessing effort, and that we expect, Office of Drinking Water expects to migrate that small system UCMR data into our CIDWA state, and the water systems don't need to do anything. On the other hand, for medium and large water systems who hired their own laboratory, they need to reach out to their laboratory and request the laboratory to reprocess the data. And we're aware that may cost an additional cost for doing that data processing. And again, this is not resampling. It's basically recalculating the data that the laboratory already has. And then the laboratory must submit the reprocessed data through our CMDP. And so the other thing to keep in mind is that the UCMR data collection process is still going on, and so some water systems haven't completed their sampling just yet. And if you're in that case, in that situation, now would be a good time to have a conversation with your laboratory to get the reporting limits you need. Next slide. So it's good to know that Office of Drinking Water is now accepting data, PFAS data, through our CMDP, and FAQs are now published and on ODW's website. We have a link in the slide, so when you get a hold of the slides, you can find that, or you can just Google laboratory FAQs on our PFAS webpage. We have some requirements for the method codes. ODW require at a minimum the 6 regulated analytes, but we would prefer to have the full list of analytes that each method provides. And as a reminder, the reporting limits are 1/3 of the PQL for each regulated analyte. And so we have the table to the right in the slide here, which shows the PQLs and the reporting limits. As a reminder, FRBs are required, but reporting of the FRBs is required when the sample has a detection or a qualitative result as a sample type field blank or FB. So in other words, if there's a detection in the water sample or the FRB. And Leslie Holt, our Our technical laboratory liaison can answer all your questions. Next slide. And with that, we're going to transition to Mr. Robert Kiefer, who's our CIDWIS administrator, and he'll tell us all about sample collection. Take it away, Robert.
Thank you, Bob. Howdy, my name is Robert Kiefer, and I'm CIDWIS administrator with ODW, but I was a field guy for 19 years and have pulled a few samples, including about 20 for PFAS, and I haven't had a blank detect yet, so I'm here to tell you what has worked for me. Next slide, please, Julie. So what makes PFAS samples different? These samples aren't difficult to collect. What makes them different is that the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, for these compounds is incredibly low compared to most drinking water contaminants. For example, the primary maximum contaminant level for perfluorooctanoic acid, or PFOA, is 4 nanograms per liter. These samples are collected in 250 milliliter bottles, so even 1 nanogram of this material in a sample causes a problem. Give you some sense of it. What weighs 1 nanogram? One of your skin cells weighs 1 nanogram, and you've got 30 trillion cells in your body. Point being, a little bit of cross-contamination from you or the sample environment is a big problem. To help tell the difference between cross-contamination and real results, these PFAS sample sets will include field blanks, as folks have mentioned. Now, I hope you don't have cyanide or mercury on your fingertips, but you may have PFAS compounds all around you. Next slide, please. So PFAS compounds, as mentioned, are used to give materials water, grease, and stain-resistant properties, and they're used in manufacturing to reduce friction. They show up in food packaging, waterproof materials, and watch straps, among many other places. I will call your attention, the materials highlighted in red are fluoropolymers that are found in water facilities. There's some speculation they might contribute to PFAS. PTFE, or Teflon, is used in pipe compound and plumber's tape and is in some valve seats. PVDF is used in membrane modules and metering pumps, and Viton O-rings and gaskets are also common in water facilities. I will tell you, I pulled a sample from the spigot on the left that's plumbed with no fewer than 9 joints using Teflon tape and got results below trigger levels, so these materials may not cause a problem, but definitely note if your facility has them, so if your results are unsatisfactory, you can investigate and eliminate those possible causes of cross-contamination. Because PFAS compounds are so widely used, when you pull these samples, your goal is to have only what you need and nothing you don't to minimize cross-contamination risk. So what do you need? Next slide, please, Julie. You will need a well-laundered short sleeve cotton shirt, well-laundered cotton pants. Take note, don't use dryer sheets or fabric softener. You will need soap. I used regular ivory bar soap. You'll need a ballpoint pen, powder-free nitrile gloves, a cooler with some regular water ice. You'll need a plastic bag for the sample containers, and you'll need sample containers, blank containers, and blank water. And then you'll need sample paperwork. You'll get some of these this stuff from your lab. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Julie.
It should be showing up for
There
you.
we go. Yeah. So regarding laboratory choice, DCLS is not yet an option. You have to use a lab that's on DCLS's list of certified labs. I've reproduced that over on the right. There are 17 of them as of today. None of them are in Virginia, meaning that if you run a sample through one of these labs, you'll have to figure out overnight shipping. Some Virginia labs will subcontract samples to one of these labs and handle the shipping for you, which can be a good option. You might be looking at a sample cost per sample of around $300 to $700. Next slide, please. All right, regarding preservation and shipping, these samples have to be at or below 6 degrees Celsius, around fridge temp between collection and delivery to lab. If you are shipping them to the lab in another state, you got to overnight them to make sure that there's plenty of ice by the time they get to the lab. The bottles do have preservative in them, so don't wash them out. If you're running EPA 533, the preservative is ammonium acetate, which has an unpleasant aroma, and so don't be surprised by that when you open the bottle and you're going to pull the sample. The method hold time between collection and analysis for EPA 533 is 28 days, and for 537.1, it's 14 days. But talk to your lab about their timetable for when you need to get the samples to them and how they want to receive them. You can stick these samples in a fridge if it's not convenient to ship the same day that you collect them, but make sure that the bottles remain in sealed plastic bags when they're sitting in the fridge to reduce the risk of contamination. Next slide, please. There we go. So the day of sampling, you want to take some precautions. You want to brush your teeth and shower, but don't put on any cosmetics, deodorant, etc., and so forth. You do want to put on your well-laundered short-sleeve cotton shirt, your well-laundered cotton pants. Remember, no waterproof materials, no fabric softener or dryer sheets. I'm suited up here over on the right to go pull PFAS samples in that sort of attire. If you have a facility where either you're required to or it's a good idea to wear safety toe shoes, make sure that they're not Gore-Tex or some other waterproof material with PFAS. Next slide, please. While the slide loads, one thing to take note of, you wonder if these precautions are really necessary. I know a fella who took no precautions at all and got a good sample, but I also know somebody who wore a brand new hat and pulled some PFAS samples and had both sample and blank contamination for perfluorobutanoic acid, or PFBA. So cross-contamination is absolutely possible. So in terms of sample location, you'll pull these from the entry point to distribution. That'll represent one or more sources pumping to a common location where it then goes out to consumers. That will be after treatment, if you've got treatment, and may also be after storage. If you have any questions about where your entry point tap is, contact your ODW field office for help. Next slide, please. All right, there's our entry point tap. Reminder, don't use any hoses for sampling. If your spigot is outside, don't sample on a rainy day. Use a little bit of common sense. If your spigot is in a busy kitchen, for example, get people to stay out of the kitchen while you're going through this process. Next slide, please. All right, before you go to sample, make sure that everything is working as it should. Make sure all the sources that should be running are operable. Make sure all your treatment is operable before you start pulling samples. If not, make sure to troubleshoot and fix it so that when you get these samples, they accurately represent the entry point that they are supposed to. Turn off anything that blows air around to minimize how much dust is getting kicked up in the air. If you've got a pump house or a system that's offline, run it for at least 15 minutes prior to sampling to make sure you get fresh water. It may take longer than that. Remove the aerator if there is one at the sample tap. You want to have the sample bottles in a handy location so you're not running all over the place. A folding TV table works pretty well as a temporary workspace for this. Do not remove the caps on the bottles yet. You want to take off your watch and any jewelry that you've got on your hands and wrists. And then if there are other folks there, you want to have those non-sampler folks stand back well away from you while you're doing these samples. Don't put the bottles on the floor, mind you. All right, next slide, please. All right, so you are ready to sample. You will flush the sample tap for 5 minutes. You will reduce the flow to a trickle. You'll wash up to your forearms with soap. You'll rinse and then you'll dry. What do you dry your hands on? You'll dry them on your well-laundered cotton shirt and pants. Once your hands are dry, you'll put on the powder-free nitrile gloves. Then you will fill the first sample bottle and cap. Then in turn, you will fill the other sample bottles and cap one at a time. Once that's done, you will transfer blank water to the blank bottles and cap one at a time. Do not lean over the bottles. If you've got a sample spigot near the floor, you may have to squat down to pull them. And don't set the caps down. Now, you're going to be wearing gloves for this, and that will make it easy to fumble finger something and maybe drop a cap, so take care with that. Next slide, please. All right, if you do drop the cap or you drop the bottle or something else happens where you don't trust that you're going to get good results, do not analyze it. Contact the lab for advice. It may make some sense if when you go to get your sample bottles, if you ask the lab for an extra container, that may be nice in the event something bad does happen. You won't have to sweat it. But don't analyze a sample that you might suspect could be bad, because it's not worth taking the risk. At the best, the consequences of a bad initial monitoring sample are more frequent monitoring and therefore more cost. But at worst, it eventually could mean that you might need treatment, even though perhaps it's a risk or a problem due to cross contamination. So take care with that. Next slide, please. All right, after you have these samples in hand, you will complete the sample paperwork and labeling. You'll put the labeled samples in a plastic bag, you'll seal it, and you'll place it in the cooler with some regular water ice. You will record your sample collection notes in your log book or on your log sheet. Once you do have them sealed in your cooler, you don't want to take them back out and open up the bottles for any reason. But anyway, once you have that done, you'll pack with regular water ice to make sure that the samples are received by the lab less than 6 degrees C. If you have to stick them in the fridge, take note, as mentioned above, not to take them out of their bags and whatnot. And then you will deliver or overnight ship to the lab. And then at that point, you just wait for results. In our experience, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to get results back for these samples. Julie, next slide, please. All right, when you get the results, you want to review those results for accuracy. If there's a discrepancy between the information you recorded on the paperwork and what the lab reported, or something else you take note of that seems unusual, contact the lab immediately to get corrections made. Once you have that result in hand, you also want to make sure that your lab has reported that result to ODW. You can see what results ODW has received on our website in Drinking Water Viewer. You will get this slide deck, so you'll be able to click that link and actually look at it. If you have a result that exceeds the PMCL, you should give your ODW field office call and discuss next steps. All right, good luck to you. Let us know in the chat if you've got questions, and thank you for your time and attention. Now I'll turn this over to Lisa Crabtree to talk about previously collected data.
Thanks, Robert. Next slide, please. Okay, so on November the 21st, EPA issued a memorandum to cover the previously collected data. So on initial monitoring requirements, the data must be collected later than January the 1st, 2019. It must be analyzed by EPA methods 533 or 537.1 with no modifications to those two methods. It has to be part of UCMR 5, state level, or other appropriate monitoring effort. The data from the different calendar years can be used as long as the number of the samples and the timing requirements are satisfied. The results from the sampling with obvious sampling errors, such as PFAS detection in the field reagent blanks, can be deleted or replaced with a new collection as long as the timing requirements are satisfied. So if there's a problem, if the field reagent blank comes back with a positive or with a result in it instead of coming back blank, then you can replace that quarter or that semi-annual period with one from a preceding or from an succeeding quarter then, or semi-annual period, then that's okay, you can do that. And samples collected after June the 24th, 2024, then it must be from an EPA or Virginia certified lab from the Next slide, please. Also in that November the 21st, 2024 memo, there was information on the UCMR 5 data. So the UCMR laboratories only report values at or above the UCMR 5 MRLs to the EPA. Currently, EPA is working with EPA contracted labs to reprocess the data for small systems, which that definition is 10,000 or fewer customers. For the larger systems, greater than 10,000 or more customers, then those large systems, you'll need to work with the labs to reprocess that data to use for initial monitoring. Data reporting, the ODW will encourages you as Waterworks to produce a plan to meet initial monitoring requirements that will allow to repeat data collection if necessary, i.e., don't wait to the very last minute. If you wait to the very last minute and you have a problem, then you're not going to meet your initial requirements. And we will be posting information on some initial monitoring data. Next slide. So, if multiple years of data are available, the most recent data are to be used for determining compliance monitoring frequency. For example, if you collected in first quarter of 22, but then you also collected in first quarter of 25, then obviously you have to use first quarter of 25. Systems must ensure all required quarterly or semi-annual sampling periods are represented with sample calendar months appropriately spaced. You can get more information from the actual general initial monitoring requirements section in 40 CFR 140.902 B18. Next slide, please. So, examples of what exactly is going to be required. So for surface water, GOODY, groundwater that's greater than 10,000 customers, 4 quarterly samples are required. First quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. Simple enough. Waterworks already collected samples in February, which is the first quarter, and then in August, which is the third quarter of 2024. So they need to collect 2 additional samples to meet the initial monitoring requirements. So the remaining samples can be collected in any time during April and June, which is the second quarter, or October through December, which is the fourth quarter. And it doesn't matter if it's in 2025 or 2026, as long as they cover both the second quarter and the fourth quarter, so that you have all 4 calendar quarters covered. For groundwater systems covering that have less than 10,000 customers, those are the biannual periods. So you have to cover 2 samples every 5 to 7 months apart. So this Waterworks pulled 1 sample in April of 2024. They need 1 more sample to meet their initial monitoring requirements. So they need to pull somewhere in either September, October, or November. Doesn't matter if they pull it in 2024, 2025, or 2026. Any of those 3 years will be happy. We just have to have 2 samples 5 to 7 months apart, calendar-wise, but they can be different years. And that part is what kind of is confusing. And that is all for the previously acquired data examples.
Okay, I'm glad you all have joined us. I'm going to turn it over to Bailey to handle any questions that you might have. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, we are offering contact hours for this. I'm going to put the link in the chat for you to fill it out if you would like the contact hours. So Bailey, here you go.
Thank you. I see the questions that have been added to the chat, and I appreciate the questions that have been asked thus far. Since we are at 2:50 and we've allotted an hour for this, I feel like it's appropriate if we take time for questions. I see that there's a couple in the chat. Denise has answered the water softener. And while there could be an impact to that, potentially, whether it's removal or leaching from an old water softener, I believe that you are limited in your ability to dictate where to take that sample. It should be taken at the entry point to where it's the distribution system. So that's required as far as the sample location is concerned. Do you need to reprocess all the UCMR5 data or just the regulated PFAS? You can ask the laboratory if there is a cost-effective measure to only reprocessing the regulated compounds. Those are the ones that do need to be reprocessed. So yes, you can target those 6 analytes as of now. Of course, as we mentioned in the webinar, the intent of EPA is to only regulate the PFOA and PFOS, but as of now, as the rule states now, there are the 6 compounds still. So yes, if you ask the laboratory to reprocess data, you can target those 6. Amy, I see a question about who do you contact to find out if your church has taken a sample. You would reach out to your field office representative and they can find that out for you. Feel free to follow up from this webinar if you need more information related to that. Any other questions from participants? Well, thank you for your attendance and time today.
All right. Thank you for joining us. Again, if you want contact hours, the link is in the chat, and y'all have a great day.